Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I thank you for your patience as well. And so this is what I'm going to talk about. My name is Samu Szemerey, and I'm an architect and urbanist. I'm one of the founders and currently the director of content at TEH, Hungarian Contemporary Architecture Center, and I usually work in what I used to say at the boundaries of technology, creative industries, and the built environment. So what we're doing and what I'm doing personally is usually in that context, and the stuff that I'm going to talk about is usually playing in this context, but I think it has relevance in a broader sense as well. So this session, I'll have a fairly brief talk, about half an hour or so, maybe less, 20 minutes or half an hour. But since we have time, even though the train was late, I hope that we'll have some time to either go into an in-depth discussion session, which I think should be much more interesting than just me talking, or even a small workshop, although I don't see enough space for that. So I hope that we'll have a vivid discussion. But what I wanted to talk about is how we can, or how we did, in my experience, and how we can reframe cultural activities. TEH, Contemporary Architecture Center, Hungarian Contemporary Architecture Center is a dominantly cultural organization, and we have existed for 15 years, which is in fact quite an accomplishment, I think, for an NGO to actually not only survive but even grow in a 15-year period. And we have learned a lot of lessons, and one of the key lessons there is how we see ourselves as a cultural player. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about status and how we understand culture. Is it a luxury item? Is it something that, how do we finance that based on how we understand culture? Is it even accountable? If we support culture, how does culture spend our money or sponsors' money? Does it have any significance? Is it important how they spend it? Does it have any meaning? I'm going to talk about some methods. How can we actually attach methods to this kind of accountability? Can we measure the impact of culture somehow? Does it make sense? And then I hope we'll be talking a lot about design, about how we can design impact, or should we design impact? Should we design goals with cultural activities? Should they be goal-driven or not? And finally, I'll also talk about place. Of course, this is hopefully not another Creative Cities talk. That's something that's behind us, but it was a big thing in the 90s. So I think we should reflect on how this might or might not differ from what we've learned from that period. So let's get into it. I'm sure many of you experienced last week's big global pandemonium, which was the 6-hour blackout of Facebook and everything else. Now, there's actually a website, I don't know if you've seen this, which has an economic method. It's called the cost of shutdown tool, which applies actual economics to calculate the cost of shutdowns. So I made a rough estimate at the world impact of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp down for 6 hours, and that's roughly $1 billion. Which might be surprising. Actually, I did the calculation for Slovakia as well. It's a bit more than $1 million. So a 6-hour period of blackout of, US-based social media companies. And I think it's really interesting. To ask the question, we are behind or in the middle of already 1.5 years of a pandemic, where among many other things, for several months, cultural institutions have been closed. We had to close for more than 6 months as well. We are severely restricting our activities and the public interfaces. We are very serious about that, and I think many theaters and all sorts of cultural institutions and organizations are doing the same. Is there a way to put a number to that? What's the impact of 9 months, 12 months of shutdown of culture financially? If we have such an easy tool to calculate that you actually go to a public website and put in 3 points of data and then you get a number, which is of course an estimate and it's more of a symbol than an actual meaningful thing, but still it makes things realistic and accountable in many ways. It makes them actionable. Such as, let me show you something which is like a completely different context, completely different scale, but it's the same logic. This is data from a single sensor of bike traffic that was installed by the Hungarian Cyclist Club in 2010 on one of the boulevards in downtown Budapest. This was the first sensor that was starting to measure the number of bikers that were passing on that boulevard. I mean, as those of you who are from Central Europe, you're probably familiar with the idea of how cyclists are seen in larger cities in Central Europe and still many European cities. However, this, and of course, if you are in an urban planning context, you will also know that the reason for traffic engineers to put so much focus on cars is often driven by the fact that cars are the only traffic type that actually gets counted. So it's as simple as that. If you have a road and they are counting traffic, they're counting the number of cars. So that's the thing that actually becomes tangible. That's what helps you make decisions. Until you get a number of cyclists or pedestrians, you don't have any sort of compatibility, and then you can very easily say that cycling is a hobby, and it's a sport. It's not something that should be put on roads. But so this single sensor that was installed actually showed both the number of traffic or cyclists passing by in a monthly aggregate, but it also shows how this was rising and how it was sort of a self-enforcing circle. Because it became visible, then it became sort of a reinforcement that yes, this is doable, there's more cyclists coming, and it became so impactful that, I mean, not this single sensor, but this process actually led to a very profound shift and transformation of how cyclists are now being seen in Budapest, what sort of infrastructure is being developed for them, and how they're basically becoming a part of mobility in general. So, we have a tool to calculate social media shutdowns, we have a tool to calculate traffic. Do we have a tool to calculate culture? Can we put a number on that? Is it even meaningful? There's a lot of criticism which says that culture should not be recontextualized in a neoliberal economy. There's a lot of criticism going towards the accountability of such institutions, because the moment you're sort of transforming cultural activities into something of a business, then it sort of becomes compromised, either for aesthetics or mission or any other way. But still, I mean, I think it's a valid question to ask, can we measure that? Is there a way to do that? And what sense does it even make? How do we start? And then normally if you ask the question, then that, you look at the budget, what's your income for an opera house? You're selling tickets, you're selling tickets, you're probably selling some merchandise. Then you have sponsorship, and then you have state finance. And I think this is the sort of typical general template for any sort of cultural activity, whether you're an NGO or whether you're an opera house. You have some kind of state or assumed state or local city-backed financing, and this is what many cultural NGOs are actually sort of fighting for. That's the sort of European way that culture should be supported by the state. Of course, all institutions are competing for sponsorship. And then on the other hand, there isn't really any meaningful way to make sense of this. What's the basis upon which you're deciding whether the money is well spent or not? Is it efficiency? What's the metrics for culture to be efficient? Is it the number of people visiting that performance? Is it the critiques? I mean, you might have thousands of people showing up, but the performance might still be crap, or it might be the other way around. What's the actual measure for that? Is there like a product value you can put on it? I think this is something that we can debate for a long time, but one of the key things about this is that most of the metrics that are attached to financing culture are pointing inwards. They're looking at how, is it a popular product? Is it a good product? It's all about the end result. And I think there might be a way to look at it differently. And this is where we need to get back to the idea of creative cities, which I'm sure most of you will know. This is a theory and a sort of a framework to understand urban development that became very popular in the late 1980s, and it ran roughly until the 2010 financial crisis. And the key thesis of this theory was that, in fact, the creative economy, which consists of cultural activities and media, and there's several other ways to categorize it, but generally I think the people are sitting here, I assume most of you are in this bucket. So the creative economy is actually what says Richard Florida and several others in late 80s, early 90s, that this is going to be the next driving force of urban development after industries have left cities. We have this is Bilbao, an industrial city from where industry has left, and then what's remaining is actually a crisis, and financial crisis, an economic crisis, and a demographic crisis as well. And so creative cities theory says that the knowledge economy, the high added value economy, which is usually coming along with culture, is the savior, and it's a kind of a new force. And the way to drive this economy is to have large investments, creative economy related investments in these cities, such as the Guggenheim Bilbao, which was a very large investment indeed, and several others followed, but this is the most famous example. And then these museums and these cultural institutions will actually attract a lot of others to come there. First of all, global tourism, and then that will attract a lot of other services and so on, restaurants, hotels, what have you. And this goes a long way, all the way to how media companies should be attracted in these neighborhoods, and and so on and so forth. But I think the key issue there is that the general framework of creative cities really looked at a kind of a general idea of globalization, of global cities. So this was working mostly for global cities. The traffic, the knowledge transport, the economic interactions, and the communication and media and branding were all focusing on, world scale. And you can always ask the question, like, okay, what happened to this guy here, like the barber shop on the corner? And I think this is where there's a lot of criticism that can be put towards the creative work. And in fact, Florida himself has criticized his own theory, saying that, in fact, it contributed to gentrification and a sort of a destructive transformation of local economies, whatever that remained from there. So I think this is where we can depart from this point. And I'll want to tell you the story of Cake, because this is the story I know best, to tell you how we came to understand our role and how that changed with us, and how we see this kind of economic impact as a key role for us to go forward. So Cake was established in 2005. We opened in 2006, roughly 15 years ago, in an unused workshop building of a museum's backyard. And I think this is a very typical scenario for all cultural institutions. Most of you have been through that. We're actually sitting in such a space now. You have an unused building which is in some sort of condition, better or worse. You have some people coming in. Then you have the winter coming, so you have people sitting in jackets and coats in rooms and listening to lectures, and then you hope it's going to get better. You start looking for sponsors, you have some partnership, you organize an exhibition. That's what we did as well. This is a mission-driven thing. You don't think about finances, it's about self-exploitation. You contribute your free time, maybe your working time as well. And then you either get somewhere or don't get somewhere. For us, this was a brief period. We were kicked out of this building after roughly more than a year, although we had a contract for much longer. But luckily, we didn't start to invest very heavily into the development of the building. But still, it started a sort of a transformation for us where we meaning mostly architects and cultural managers and so on, who started this whole organization. First, of course, we had programs which were welcomed from elsewhere. So we had exhibitions coming in from institutions who did the exhibition. We had film festivals and lectures organized by others, or lectures done by visitors. But very quickly, we started to realize that actually we should and can produce our own stuff. So I think it was a major next step for us, which also coincided with the move. Once we were kicked out, we were already quite popular at the time. And we were very quickly approached by a private developer who was looking to tear down and reuse a post-war modernist office building and parking garage, which is like in the heart of Budapest, or it was in the heart of Budapest. But they knew they had still sort of 2 years ahead of them until that started, so they actually were approaching us, well, can you do something with this building? We know you have lost your previous venue. So for these 2 years, between 2008 and 2009, we actually became the largest architecture center of Europe, because we had more than 5,000 square meters and space, which is both a blessing and a major issue, because you have to fill that with something. So of course you can have a fancy opening party and everybody's there and we're very happy, but then you have to be there the next day too. So I think that really inspired us to start producing our own stuff. besides having international exhibitions, traveling there, and then basically sort of rejuvenating that building, which then stood for more than 10 years before it was torn down finally. But I think the next phase for Cake came when we shifted towards doing our own things and becoming one of the producers of the international cultural economy, if you will. And then we lost this building as well. And then for several years, we had just the production office in various locations. But I think that sort of push led us to start projects which were, of course, again, I'm talking about architectural context here in terms of culture. So all of you will have your own things, and I hope we'll be able to talk about that. But we already started working on projects which were looking at, okay, how does the city work? How is architecture understood? And this was our core mission. We wanted to talk about contemporary urban issues and architecture because nobody talked about that at the time. So we started projects like this one, which was looking at abandoned properties across the city. This is a crowd map. We did a sort of community-based mapping. We did with fieldwork, and then we built several versions of this map over several years, which were putting out basically the first collection of first ground floor shop windows and shop fronts and ground floor properties that were empty and unused. And then we started to develop several programs around that. We tried to work with the city, with the city-owned properties. We established a festival which is called Open, where we approach owners and with those who we can agree, they open up their empty properties for a short period of time, and then they have some someone coming in to use it, some kind of organization. And then we already at the time, we were trying to achieve long-term results. So we said that, okay, let's do this for a month, but let's also negotiate throughout this month with both the owners and the tenants of what would be a successful, workable, sustainable model of renting this property. So because for the owner, it's obviously good, even if they're not making sort of profit, but it's still being used by someone. So it's not losing its value. For those who are core cultural organization, they get a steep discount and it can work. So in some few cases, that was actually successful. And then after, what's happening? Okay, so after 6 or 7 years, we actually, partly through this activity, we found an empty bank that became our venue, which we've been at now for I think 5 or 6 years. I'm not sure. Which we're using for several functions. We have exhibitions, we have conferences. It's a co-working space during the day. It's a very nice location. So I hope most of you will be able to come at some point. But the point I wanted to make is that this sort of vision of how we work with the city and talk about culture and do cultural activities got transformed in the process. And so our programs now, most of our programs are engaging with culture in this sort of productive way. One of the most famous programs Cake has been doing for 11 years now is called Budapest 100. It's an open house weekend, which is basically a celebration of 100-year-old buildings progressing every year, which entered into some difficulty in recent years because of the First World War, and then the crisis after that. But we resolved that with topics. But the key point is that the way this got transformed is that this is actually not organized by us. I mean, we are organizing it, and we have several hundred volunteers and people working with us. But the key thing is that we always approach the owners of these buildings, whether these are houses which have several apartments in them and owners, or these are factories or schools, and they are the ones who come up with the program. And of course, it works now because it has been several years. But that's not only a sort of a nice feature that we have community-based programs. It's actually the goal of this program. And the goal is to not only to have several thousand people come and visit their own city, which is very popular, as it turns out, but also for these people to realize that they have something to do with the city. And then I personally consider the most successful parts or afterlife of this program are those buildings where the owners, after participation, realized that actually they like this building so much that they renovated it in a community effort. So they applied for some money, and then some of these houses actually got renewed after participating in this festival, which I think is absolutely great. And so we've been transforming these programs as well, and I think that's the sort of next phase. So after just first being a sort of net cultural organization, organizing programs, then a cultural organization producing programs and content, and the next phase is realizing that we actually have some kind of knowledge that is probably valuable in both in cultural terms, but maybe in other terms as well. And then we started producing programs where we sort of try to use this knowledge and the stuff that we produce to achieve other results as well. So to sort of to change how the city works, which I think has been the ultimate goal of culture forever, but maybe it's not always so explicit. So this also means that we try to sort of transform our individual programs, of which there are many, into tools. So we're looking at our own projects now, even if, like this Budapest 100 Festival, as tools in a toolkit that we remix and expand, and then this is the toolkit that we use to produce new programs, such as this one, where we were looking at one of the largest brownfield sites of the whole country, basically in southern Budapest, which is a very peculiar location. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to explain if anyone is interested. The point is, we for example, brought this Budapest 100 Festival as a tool to this several-year program, and then we had an open factory weekend, which was not 100, but it was like a weekend of open factories. And there again, the point was that it was the factories who were making the programs. And for them, it was a shockingly new situation, very uncomfortable most of the time, that they actually met people from the street coming to this factory area, and then they realized that actually that site and the stuff they do, which is usually have to do some with metallurgy and, you know, pretty sort of really heavy industry stuff, that this is actually interesting. It's actually attracting people. People like to come there and see that, and they never thought of this and never thought of the area and the place as something which could be interesting. So again, after 4 years, one of the things that we did is collect all the activities and companies in the area. We were the first ones to make a complete comprehensive database of this place. Nobody knew, even the factories who were active in this area. It's very large. Nobody had any complete idea of what's going on there. We were the first ones to produce a map of actually what's happening there. Who are the owners? What are the activities? How can they possibly connect it into a meaningful cluster of activities and innovation? And then besides all of this was made kind of a public program in a fairly interesting situation. And then we were lucky enough to, and this is where I'm getting to the actual measurement, we were lucky enough to work on this project in an international program, which was called Shared Cities. And several partners were active from Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, and elsewhere too. And then one of the components that the consortium was doing is we had a very good expert, Teresa Rabová from the Czech Republic, who helped us develop a methodology to actually measure the economic impact and footprint of this program across all of these countries. But I just wanted to show you the results for this country, because I think it tells a lot about where this can be going. All of the stuff that I talked about up to now. So there were 2 organizations participating in this program from Hungary. This is the sort of the Hungarian framework within the whole project. And then we had a number of activities. We had a number of participants, which was actually quite high. And then this was the total budget for the whole 4-year program for the 2 organizations. And half of this budget was the European money that was coming from Creative Europe. So you should memorize like 130,000 euros. That's what we got. That was the start. And then all the visitor spending, and there are ways to measure that, was amounting to this amount. So there was a total spending which was spent by us making the program and the visitors of the programs up to 750,000 euros. And this is what's called a direct impact. Now, of course, all of the services that we bought, all of the installations that we produced, everything, the programs had second effects as well, because they were ordered by someone. Those people who were producing the catering, the theater performances, the everything, they had to build their installations, they had to pay their own expenses. They had their partnership. Oops, sorry. This is what's called and other things as an indirect impact, where you have like the secondary and tertiary spin-offs, and this is what's called an input-output method. And so the total output of this program was over €1,100,000, which is roughly 10 times as much as the European support that was coming in, the sponsorship money. And of course, the interesting point is, of course, taxes always. So we paid this much tax in the end, and we can also generate, we can calculate how many jobs were created throughout that. So to sum it up, we received €1 grant, and we made a total output of €8.4 of that. I don't think that's that bad from a cultural organization. So, and suddenly you have a perspective of yourself when you're asking for money from a sponsor, or when you're applying for a grant with this number behind your back. So instead of saying, well, architecture is so important, it's not so much part of public life, of culture, and we are so clever, and we've been active for 15 years, so please give us some money so we can make a conference, or we can make an exhibition, because it's the Venice Biennale is so nice, and we are so good, and we can make an exhibition there, which we did, by the way. But this is a very different story from saying, well, we have all of this, and this is how much we can make from €1 grant. So if you're a private company, or if you're a state, and you're putting your money to us, this is how we're going to spend it. And you can also tell in your corporate report or in your report that this is how you put your money to work. And I think that's a very different story. And this is where I think all public or all cultural institutions and NGOs should be looking at themselves through this mirror, at least sometimes, or to understand, or just even to the point of understanding this, like, what are you doing? What are you actually doing with your money? Can you see the effects in total of what you're doing? And if you get back to this slide about, how do we measure that, and what's the metrics, then I wanted to say, for us in recent years, the most important thing became impact. It's so important that actually it's on our sort of core values now. We have a couple of core values that we think that it's driving of where we want to go as an organization. But impact doesn't have to be financial. There's the sort of tangible part of that, which is about, how much money is being spent, how much money is returned, and so on. But there's sort of intangible parts to that. So what's happening to those who you work with? Can you influence the way you're working? Can you help them? And also, which is very important, how local can you be? The numbers that I showed previously are calculated on the national economy. It's a fairly simple model. Maybe Teresa wouldn't agree with me, but it looks like a simple model, but it's much more complicated to calculate your footprint locally. But this is where you can make assumptions, not necessarily based on financial output, but on what you want to achieve and how you work with your local partners, who you work with. So when you design a program, you also have to design, besides designing the money spent and the content of your program, it's really good to think about, where do you want this money to work? What do you want this money to do besides, having the lighting and the acoustics and everything in place? What are the new activities that you want to kickstart with that, which it's not your activities but someone else's activities? Can you think of anything that it helps others expand or achieve result? Can you think of anything that makes your neighborhood more resilient and meaningful and life better in your neighborhood, even if your mission is global? And in fact, the other thing which we did in this Shared Cities program was we worked with museums, because most museums tend to have very high-profile visions and programs. So they are the National Museum of something, which means they have no idea about what's happening in the next street, even though they have been there for more than 100 years. Like the National Museum and so on, and I think it's a fairly interesting proposal for these museums or cultural institutions to approach them and to try to help them understand what's happening in the next street and how they might be able to connect that without compromising their very high-profile vision and activities. And I wanted to bring you two case studies or examples. Rather, I wouldn't go into the details here again. One is from Bratislava, the other is from Budapest. They are fairly different, but I think they both point towards this direction. I'm sure most of you know the Stara Triznica and its story as well. For those who don't know, it's an old market hall in Bratislava that had been closed down for several years. It was owned by the city. It was operating at loss. And then a group of entrepreneurs and cultural activists approached the city, and after several rounds of tough negotiations, they managed to get a temporary use for the lease for this building, so they could use it for a short period of time. This is one story, and then they transformed the market. And the other story is the so-called Freedom Bridge or Franz Josef Bridge before the Second World War in Budapest, which had to be closed down for technical maintenance a few years ago. So what happened was that this consortium actually thought more of themselves as what I have shown you with every cultural institution who moves into a cold, unused building. And so they took out bank loans, and they put together a long-term strategy of how this could actually turn into a sustainable investment, and they transformed the market hall very quickly into an event venue. They reopened the market, which is also sort of, they had a very strong quality policy of, who's selling what and how do you support producers to have better quality, and how do you connect them with restaurants, some of whom were located in the same building, to buy the produce from those farmers who come in here. So it became actually a profitable operation, which was mixing for-profit and non-profit activities with an explicitly cultural vision. And the the Freedom Bridge in Budapest was basically occupied by the youth of the city within days of its being closed down, because the maintenance wasn't actually happening on the bridge, so it was just closed down from traffic. And for several weeks, the municipality of Budapest was basically fighting against this, in all sorts of ways. But then they realized that, in fact, what's happening is that the best public space is just being created right now in Budapest. And they sort of grudgingly accepted the fact that there is a very popular new venue. This was partly spontaneous, but it was partly the fruits of almost 10 years of work of an organization, an NGO in Budapest that's called the River and the City, Vajó, Város and Folyó, who had been working at several points along the Danube to reconnect the city with its river. And so I think both cases, in very different scales, very different backgrounds, very different financial and other means, achieved a deep impact in how cities work through cultural programming and clever strategic and also tactical thinking and activities. So I think when we're designing forward, and this is what I hope to be able to discuss with you. So I'm very interested in your opinions and experiences and questions. So we usually design, budgeting and programming. I'm sure all of you know that. When you apply for money, when you do your usual daily deals, but do you design for this? Do you have an idea in mind, like what is it that you want to multiply in resources, in means, in human capacity, in actual results, and I'm not talking about fancy things here. I'm talking about very practical stuff. What is it that you want to be transformed? Do you want a house to be, renovated because of a festival that's happening in the house or in the neighborhood? What are the local resources that you can map and hope to enforce or expand? And finally, but really importantly, what are the methods that you're going to develop through that? If you're a cultural organization, even if you're producing exhibitions as a gallery or opera pieces as an opera, there is a method to doing that. And most cultural organizations don't formalize these methods. They don't reflect on how they're actually doing it. They achieve a certain level of efficiency, and I think efficiency is pretty much the only metric that they use. Like, how can we use the minimum of our very scarce resources to actually do something? Instead of that, or beyond that, I really suggest you should think about each of your programs, like what were you using and how? And can you develop that into a tool that can be multiplied, that can be handed over to others, that can be developed into a brand that you want others to pay for? Budapest 100 is now a brand that basically companies and districts and cities are competing for. We have too many people coming to us asking us to do this for them somewhere. first of all, we don't want to, inflate or sort of, lose the value of the brand. So we don't do too many of these things. But the reason why we can do this is that from the very beginning, the team of Budapest 100 have been very conscious about putting down a method that is actually broken down into days and number of activities and types of activities and tasks that you can just hand over in a leaflet to anyone, and they can do it without your participation. And that means that we can operate with more than 200 volunteers every year, who are, at least half of them are new every year. So there's many who stay on, but many of them are new, and they know from day one what they're going to be doing and why they're doing it and what they're going to achieve with that. So I think the moment you can put down these methods and then you can think of how you can repeat them elsewhere, put them in a factory and it achieves something else. And there are several other things which we're also doing like that. That's going to help you both in terms of financial activities, but especially in terms of impact and how you can plan forward. So this is pretty much what I wanted to say, and I hope we can start a discussion from here. I think there are too many of us in too small a space to have a workshop, but I hope we can get into a discussion on the remaining time. I'm not sure how much time is left, but I think that should be enough to have questions. So thank you for your patience and your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions again.
Hi, this was very, very interesting, very exciting. Is the model that you built to calculate and all that documentation available online that other people can take and use? One of the things that I was thinking and you was talking about this is that in a way what you're doing is basically you're talking the politicians' language. What's in it for them when you go and ask them for money, which I think is the right way to do it. And one of the things I've seen is, for instance, there was a couple of years ago, the Club Commission in Berlin made a study, exactly what does the clubbing in Berlin mean for the city? And they came up with 1.5 billion euros a year.
Yeah, now it's cultural heritage in Berlin. I think it's protected.
Yes, exactly.
Techno is a cultural heritage there.
Absolutely, but that's part of that discussion. So I think, but knowing how to do this would be interesting. So is this available?
Parts of it are available. For those who are in Slovakia or in the Czech Republic, there are open platforms, like web-based platforms, which are done by Teresa Rabová and her colleagues. I think it's called Economic Impact Art. You should Google it. And then you can use those. And she developed these templates for us specifically on a country-by-country basis. Now, during the running time of the project, we shared it with everyone, and we're happy to share it now too, but we're not allowed or we're not authorized to hand it over for others to use. But I really encourage everyone to approach her. It's really good to work with her. I'm very glad about I think not only just to have done this, but to specifically to have learned all of this from her. So basically the templates are ready, I think, and the adaptation that has to be done, which includes a lot of work, and I'm absolutely not knowledgeable about that. Of course, is there's a heavy calculation side, which includes a lot of local economic factors, taxes and all sorts of impacts, several hundred points of data that need to be updated and imported based on country by country. But it's, other than that, the general framework is and Teresa told me that it's a fairly well-known method of calculating. And of course, this is an estimate. Again, it's by no means any, very specific thing, but some parts of it are available openly. The description of the method is also available as a product of this Shared Cities program. So it's up online. You can Google it. There's a report on the economic performance, and it does describe the method. It doesn't have the calculations, but to some degree, it's available.
I would like to add on what you said. So you're speaking the politician's language, and what are some experiences you have with making like techno-cultural heritage? So how do you make the politicians speak the language of culture?
In fact, we don't talk to politicians so much. We do talk to local politicians. So we're mostly working with cities. So that's municipalities. So we talk to mayors, for example. But I think mayors are a different type of politician than national level politician. And of course, you have to be able to communicate what you're doing. So if, talking politicians' language, we're spending, all of us, you guys here too, we're spending others' money. And we have to be able to tell them what we're doing with it and why they should give it to us. So I think that's, I know all the sort of criticisms going towards that and how we're, culture should be independent, and I could continue with that. But my experience of these 2 decades tells me that I don't think that works. It might work from an academic perspective. It might work from others, some specific role. But what I've experienced is I have to pay the bills, and I really want to pay everyone who is in our team a decent money, even if we cannot compete with, corporates or whatever jobs. But we really want this to be a sustainable operation. We really want this to be a clean operation. We don't want to, give people money in envelopes, as most cultural organizations have to do. And to do that, you have to be, pretty open and forward about, how you want to spend others' money. And this, of course, you can learn the routine of applying for grants, European grants, Visegrad grants, local grants, whatever. We all know the logic and the routine. But I think there's also a trap there, which is quite typical, that organizations apply for grants in order to have the cash flow to support their operations, and then after a while it becomes the key activity. Like you have to raise money to be able to spend money, but you're sort of forgetting asking yourself what you're actually spending it for, and do you expect that to make an actual impact, or do you just want to sort of, there's even an expression in Hungarian for the research grant. Do you just want to research it away? Like, do you have the money, you can sort of put in all the accounting and the reports in the end, and nobody asks you any questions about what you have actually done or achieved. So to be able to talk this kind of politicians talk, if you will, or corporate talk, I think of course it helps you be able to taken seriously. So you have to be able to talk to someone in their own terms. If it's a manager or if it's a CEO, you have to be able to speak their language on their level as much as you can. But it also helps us inward. I think for us, at least for me personally, it was a big journey of, you can call it professionalization, you can call it something else, but to take ourselves seriously, we needed to do this because after having these numbers, we really started to think about ourselves in a different way. Even though we are architects, so we're not, artists or way in the other end of the cultural spectrum. We are really sort of halfway between the economy and cultural activities per se. But to speak this language is also to understand and be able to reflect on your significance. Whether you're doing something well. And that's ultimately, I think this was my first question. So this point here is not so much about how can we put a number to what's happening here, but rather how can we understand if money is being spent well in this building. So for us, at least, that's very important, and I hope it will remain important.
Hello, I'm Laco Ravec. We cooperate with Samu. I work also in Novej Cvernovke, but I work for Slovak NGO Punkt, that is in partnership now with KEK and adapting this economic model for their project Good Market in Bratislava. So we have from Teresa now the numbers. So I totally recommend to approach her because there is a lot of adaptation you need to do if you want to use the model, and especially in also the feed the model with your data and your inputs. It's not so easy as it sounds, and especially you need to start at least collecting the information about how much something costed, how many visitors you had, and sometimes we don't have this data, so we did a kind of simulation. But what I want to ask is, how do you measure non-economic impact? You said that it's important for you that this 100 festival is having some long-term effects and so on. And you can do it somehow, I would say, anecdotally or just to observe what's going on. But do you collect some kind of evidence for seeing the impact of your year-by-year festival, do you have some maybe criteria or some kind of evaluation that you try to see the long-term effect of your activities, not only in economic sense?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I don't have a satisfactory answer for you. So we're not so strict about that. So I'm also at some point I'm becoming skeptical of too much administration for projects. The point you made earlier on, just to reflect on that, I think is important because the moment you start using this tool or any other tool really, but we have this one, so this is our tool. Others have other tools. But the moment you start using this, you're not collecting data for reporting towards financing institutions. You're collecting data for yourself, and that's a major difference, I think, in investment and everything else. Now, as for these kind of intangible impacts, maybe this one. What we do now is we expect all projects, whether they are repeating or new projects, to tell us what they want to do. Maybe, and we hope that's enough for most. And of course, I don't think if a project cannot achieve its original goals, then it's a failure. But we have these 4 points now in CAKE, which sounds sort of a cliche just listed, but one is digitization. Maybe it's interesting because of the data collection. So we're very consciously trying to import data and digital tools into cultural activities. So this is a geospatial database, for example. And I don't think many cultural organizations are very sort of data happy in that sense, or IT happy, but they should be, even an opera building, not only for the stage technology, but to understand who the audience is, how they communicate, how they approach your building, where should you be in the city to get to your audience, and that's all data driven now. So digitization is one. Sustainability is the other one, which is, blah. So I don't even want to get into that, but there are some points where we are actually serious about that. Participation and communities is the third one, which is basically the DNA of CAKE, and the fourth one is impact. So we expect all of our projects, when they're making the project proposal, to reflect on these 4 points and tell us how they want to engage them. And it's totally okay to say no. I mean, we're not interested in sustainability in this project. That's fine, but then tell me. So I think it's at this point, it's only about reflecting on that and having an idea about it, and that seems to be enough for now. I'm not sure we will have more. Maybe we will. Maybe it's in some projects we can have more of a.
Maybe, okay, I totally understand that, at least to identify it at the beginning. But do you look at the end if you achieved it, or do you reflect on how much you were?
Some projects do. You have to know that the large projects of CAKE are very independent. So we're a very flat organization. These teams which are running our largest programs, such as Budapest 100 or the Architecture Film Festival, or I could mention some others as well. These are teams which have sometimes up to 10 people in them who are working full-time throughout the whole year, but they're working on this exclusively. Some are in the back office, some are not even CAKE members, but they work or contribute. So they work very independently, and they report to us. And some projects actually measure impact. So Budapest 100 have their own metrics about how many people visited, how many houses. Of course, they know how many houses participated, but how the owners felt after. So they are doing interviews, I think, about the actual experience for the other stakeholders too. The film festival also has some sort of this kind of questionnaires. We did feedback sheets with the Chapel project, so this industrial area project. So we're doing that. It's not very systematic at this point, and I'm not sure it will be, but we're thinking about it.
I'm Eric from Amsterdam, from Melkweg, Milky Way. 15 years ago, the 4 biggest venues, cultural venues in Amsterdam, of which we were one, got the idea that the city was thinking, you're doing so well, you don't need our subsidies so much anymore. We had about 2.5 million visitors each year combined. So we started to do a survey on this multiplying effect of each spent euro in subsidy, what it would be in the city. And we found, in our case, I think it was about 6. and for the classic Concertgebouw with nearly 1 million visitors on its own, 12. So let's say it was 9. It was a nice report. We put it in the drawer. It was all the time jumping up and down to be shown. But we never were cut in subsidies, so it was not necessary to show the report. But I always wondered, and I wonder if you came across this question, if you would show it, the city might say, nice, 9 multiplying effect. But if we would spend this €1 in public transport, in the harbor, in whatever, the multiplying effect would be maybe 15 or 20. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it's a very good point. The brief answer is we're quite lucky because we don't really get money from the city. Unless they're sort of commissioning us to do a project. So Budapest 100 does get money from the city because it's also considered by the city of Budapest and some of the districts as sort of their program in a way. Maybe my colleague there in the back can reflect on that too. But I think it's a really good point, and I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer here because we haven't been using this for so long. So we haven't. I think what I would try to do, and I'm not sure how I will do it, but I would have to think about that, is to get back to culture. So culture not as the creative economy thing, which is in direct competition with what you just said, like in transportation, and basically a line in the annual budget, and then you're looking at your returns on investment. But these sort of intangible values of culture, when you can say, you addressed this many million people who had, and then you can look at, what else did they do because of participating in cultural programs and not because of participating in public transport. Maybe that would help develop some ideas of how this can be measured, and maybe that would also reflect on your point about how do you make some kind of qualitative look at what's happening. But I think it would be an interesting thing.
Because I was never studying these economic things, but I understood that this input-output model is something very used in business. And it's known that automotive industry has the highest, maybe, or industry as such has the highest multiplying effect. But it could mean that, okay, let's just support industry. But I think with culture, we can, or my argumentation would be that it has some economical impact, and beside that, it has many other invisible effects.
Quality of life, all that sort of thing. So when you look at this here, or when I could show you any of the other slides with cultural activities in cities, and this cannot be understood on financial terms only. 2 points there in the back.
Hello, my name is Martin. I'm from the Coal Bridge in Denmark. To the point, there's also the branding effect for a city. So normally, the city, when they brand the city, they use photos, images like this of your place, and not the public transport that often. So we need to be aware of the value of that as well. And following up on that, I know in Denmark, and maybe that goes for other countries as well, but some of the tourist organizations actually can help you do these figures, the return on investment budgeting, because they sometimes can help with those calculations. So that might be a place to search for that.
Yeah, I'm Gabriel from a venue in Belgium, musical venue. I think the multiplying effect, you talked about, is really high with culture as compared with, for example, steel industry. In Belgium, we had, I think it's a European figure, by the way. The multiplying effect when you use public money, for example, inside the steel industry in Belgium, was much lower than the one you get, the return money-wise you get from culture. So we don't have to be shy about that, I think. But of course, there are also, as you said, intangible effects which are really, really important too, and like well-being of the population. Because if you use public transportation to go to nowhere because there are no events, doesn't make sense, does it?
Yeah, these are good points, and let me reflect to each one. First, maybe starting with this last point. In this project, that's the closest we got to industry, I think, in many ways, from a sort of architectural and urban heritage point of view. This is a heritage area, so it's 120 or 30-year-old area with a lot of buildings. A lot of industry has sort of stretching back to that era. And I think when you look at these multipliers in industry or entrepreneurship, you have to ask exactly what are the non-tangible effects. Because if you put in €1 in the industry, I don't think anyone expects effects other than industrial output. So you would assume that this would help the companies get bigger and more profitable, and I don't know. But of course, you can ask the question, why should I put money into an entrepreneur for them to survive? But then you can ask the question, does it generate any kind of meaningful output for the city or for the location? In this case, we talked a lot about heritage. I'm not going to go into it, but I think one of the key factors of understanding this area, which, by the way, still has a lot of industrial activity, so it's not a brownfield in a sense that it's been abandoned. It's a very active area. But we can relevantly ask the question, how should this be understood as heritage? And if it is a heritage of knowledge, of skills, and of links with the district around it, how can that be meaningfully, put to work? Which it's not put to work right now. So I think that's the industry. And let me just quickly get to the other one. I'm sorry, I'm sort of losing. Your comment was about. Yes, I know what I wanted to say to that. Sorry. So, what we found, and maybe that's a point to your comment as well, is that it's very important to make a distinction of who you're talking to. And throughout these years, our points of contact with, for example, the city or with some companies have changed. And first we went to, let's say, the cultural vice mayor. Can you support us from your, drawer of cultural money? And then it became someone else. And then now we've been, in fact, approached by the Budapest brand company for sort of financial exchange. And sometimes by chief architects or urban development institutes or offices who work like with departments. That's the word I'm looking for. So I think it's very important for you or for us as a cultural organization to decide who you want to talk to, because you're going to get to very different results. If you want to go into CSR and sponsorship, that's a very different deal than going into partnership with someone with different expectations and different scales. And I think even if it's a very hardcore cultural activity as classical music concerts and what have you, I think it's a relevant choice to make. So whether you're talking to the tourism board or whether you're talking to the city branding or whoever else, you're picking your targets and your fights and your scales there. I think it's an important thing to reflect upon.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Thorsten from Moritzbastei in Leipzig, Germany. And one of the first questions that you pointed out in the beginning of your presentation is culture luxury and how we can deal with that. And I think we got a good reality test the last 1.5 years. And maybe some of you got the feeling that the culture is luxury because it was closed down very quickly, and that was something that politicians or politician decision maker thought it was affordable not to have, because the most important things were health system and stuff like this in the situation, and we were struggling a lot about this point to say culture is not luxury, it's necessarily for societies, and so I completely agree with you. And you took the good example of the Berlin Music Commission and their club study. Someone mentioned that economic figures help you to show how valuable culture is in that way, but it doesn't help you in the situation. It didn't help us in the situation that we had 1.5 years now in the pandemic, because we tried to play this card and say, look at how important the economic factors of culture are for our country and for our economy, but it doesn't help us so far to get the attention or the value that we thought we should have in a society. So I think what I want to say is, I think it's really important to speak this language and to know about what you're doing and which economic impacts you have with your work or with our work as a cultural activists or actors. But on the other hand, it's still quite necessary to find ways to show what we talked about the last minutes about, the quality of what we are doing, what it means to society and the quality of life or quality of living or civilization and stuff like that. Because if someone find a way to measure that and to convince politicians that this is really as important as economic figures, then it would be a great, great
in
effort.
fact, in recent years, this sort of quality of life indexes have been extremely popular as political talking points. So The Economist and several other media have this sort of, which is the best city to live in sort of things, which is very questionable. In my other hat, I work in a similar area and as a professional, and I have a lot of issues with that. But that's the point of connection there, maybe. I would actually be interested in everyone's perspective on that or others' perspectives, because we had so this last year and a half for us was a very weird period. In fact, we had more work than we, I think, had pretty much ever before, and we were actually expanding throughout this period. So now we have new colleagues, and I think that throughout this year and a half there were sort of different phases, and in several phases what we experienced is that people are willing to pay more for culture than they had been before. So what they took for granted before, they were actually happy to pay for from their homes if it was available remotely in some way or another, streaming mostly, and that was an interesting experience. And now in media and in elsewhere, at least in Hungary, this kind of pay for your consumption model is becoming increasingly general and accepted for other necessities as well. But what we've seen is, and we actually had a project which was which I haven't talked about, and I'm not going to, but you can check it on our website. We made a COVID database of, I think we were the only ones, I don't know about anyone else in Hungary, who collected all the community initiatives and basically any initiative that popped up, especially in the first half year in 2020, when people started to help each other out. They organized on Facebook and they coded platforms for that and blah blah blah, and then we have a collection of several hundred of these initiatives, and many of these were actually cultural. That's the point I wanted to get to. All of a sudden, many theaters, orchestras, companies, others who were active in culture figured out that they can actually stream stuff. They have an archive that they make available. And in fact, there was an abundance of cultural programs throughout this period. It was just that people became kind of worn away. And I think the reason why people stopped watching operas every evening is because they just got, there was too much anxiety on other fronts. But basically, it wasn't about these things not being available. And I'm really curious of how you went through this, or how you're in this right now, because it's still happening. Because for us, it was a very two-sided thing. So we had to close. Several programs had to be pushed. And then it also meant that when we had a period of opening, we had to do everything at once, which is an extreme strain on our resources. But still, we feel that the ground is shifting, but it's not shifting in one direction, but in several directions at the same time. Maybe you had something else to say too, but I'm not sure.
Oh no,
okay.
That was just what I wanted to add to the discussion.
Reflection, right? I mean the
I didn't
accommodation
hear the
stuff.
first part. Can you repeat?
Yeah, how would you calculate the indirect impacts of your event in terms of economical impacts?
Yeah, the engine behind this is a very large spreadsheet, and there are several lines, and one of basically there are two key input points. One is for the events, and the other is for the activities. I mean, it's not rocket science after all, but for the visitor data, we have to differentiate between local, national, and international visitors, and also in periods of visit. And we have to estimate, which is again sort of a ballpark figure, but we have to estimate how important our event was in their visit. Did they come just because of that, or did they just drop by? And then you have to say, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, of what, you know, what sort of a rough percentage of how much your program was part of their visit. And I don't know, in the case of this, we knew that it had to be almost all of, I mean, directly this reason, because this is a completely unknown part of the city for tourists, so that you don't have people dropping by, you have people coming here directly. So that helps. Sometimes you cannot be so direct about that, but these are the ways. So you differentiate between local, national, international, and you have to say how long, and you have to match a priority to their participation.
We just finished this feeding, and so there are 2 inputs. One is your own budget, and you also have to structure it, how much were salaries, how much were some materials, and these have pretty fixed formulas from other sectors. So every kind of like spending has a little bit different indirect effects. Some have higher, and also with the visitors, we also did an estimation, which is not good. You can be even more concrete, asking visitors how much they spend, but on transport, on coffee, on stuff, let's say, and also every item has a little different.
Yeah, I mean, these are sort of standard econometrics figures. So these are, I think, available in charts probably, or in templates for economists when they make these models. So this is the stuff that's outside of our expertise. It's just that we saw the complete chart as well.
And it's not something specific for culture, really. It's something that
it's general econometrics.
But you need to have a data. So you need maybe to even like estimate the number of visitors. It can be estimation. It can be very like strict method, and you should start asking people maybe how much they spend.
They won't be able to tell you, but I mean, how much you spend on transport, you know, does a monthly ticket count, or how much of it counts? So it's again, these are, you know, it goes all the ways, but I think it's more about the magnitude. That's for us, it wasn't like the, I don't know, 8.4. It was, wow, it's like, you know, 5 times at least. So that was a surprise. Probably if we're more conscious or economically knowledgeable, it wouldn't have been a surprise. But it's good to see anyway. So, I mean. Okay, so I think brilliant questions there. Thank you so much. I hope it was interesting. I hope you do this, or we'll be doing this. If you have anything more to ask, or if you're interested in what we're doing, this is a website that's under construction, but it still works. It is also available in English, so get in touch there or here. Thank you so much.